Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
Should we leave the European Convention of Human Rights? That is one of the questions we're asking, and we will attempt to get an answer to on this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. It is the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Duncan. Alongside me this week, we have our favourite angry young man, Will Yarwood from the TPA. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Duncan. I'm angry now, am I? I'm not sensitive.
I think you and the word sensitive are pretty much unlikely bedfellows, if you don't mind me making that observation. And also our guest this week is Karl Williams, Research Director at the Centre for Policy Studies. Karl, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me on.
Good to see you. A lot of stuff to talk about here. We'll get into the kind of meat this week about the ECHR, because the CPS have done a lot of good work, and there's a paper that's been released regarding where we sit as a nation with the European Convention of Human Rights. We'll get to that in a second, but Karl, there's a couple of things we should talk about. Will and I did the podcast last week with Rupert Lowe, which was good. Sadly, it was on the day that we learned about the death of Lord Tebbit. And I just wanted to ask you about this, because when I was looking you up, because that's part of my job, obviously, I was delighted to read that in your office you have a portrait of the great Norman Tebbit. So just give us a few thoughts about his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do have a portrait of Norman Tebbit. It was a gift from a colleague, one of my most valued possessions. I think his legacy is almost twofold. He's affected two generations. Obviously, he was an enormously important minister under Thatcher during the early 1980s in particular, in facing down the unions. And I mean, he himself had long held strong opinions on that. His first job was working for the FT back in the days of the closed shop. So a sort of lifelong believer in sort of the working man's rights to, trade his own labour, as it were. But also, secondly, and this is kind of where I come in, I'm a sort of younger millennial, I'm 35, the Telegraph blogs in the sort of late 2000s, I think there's probably a whole generation of young men influenced by his writing there.
Yeah, they were brilliant, weren't they?
Fantastic.
And actually introduced a whole line of thinking and ideology to, dare I say it, a younger mindset. Which is good. All right, thank you for that. I mean, well, obviously we talked about your views on Lord Tebbit last week, so we'll move on a little bit, because one of the news stories, set of stats that's appeared this week inside the last few hours is the number of universal credit claimants. Now, I could give the numbers here, Will, but I get a sense, with your angry hat on, you'd quite like to just go through some of the stats we're hearing this morning. Then, obviously, with Karl, we'll get your reactions. So what are the top-line figs?
Yeah, it's not great, Duncan, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So this data relates to universal credit rather than PIP. So we had our PIP stuff with our benefits dashboard the other week. But this morning, we've learnt that there are nearly 8 million people in the United Kingdom currently on universal credit. That's an increase from around 6.8 million in June 2024. And to make matters even worse, when in regards to getting universal credit, there's different eligibility requirements regarding, are you working, are you not working, are you looking for work? But there's people who are just written off as not looking for work at all, and there's no work requirement for receiving these universal credits. The people who are now receiving universal credit for a non-working requirement is now around 42%. Like, that's a huge number, and that's spiked up basically since the pandemic. It's around 3.6 million people claiming universal credit are now basically just not looking for work at all, while those who are looking for work has just gone plummeted. It's like this perfect X on the graph, actually, of them just going down since COVID. And to make matters even worse, there are now, as we've learned from the stats, 1.2 million migrants receiving universal credit, with actually the worst statistic being those with the indefinite right to leave to remain, which has doubled basically since October 2022. So there's now, I think, 211,000 people with that right to remain currently receiving universal credit. So yeah, it's bad, and it's hardworking taxpayers who are being used, to pay for all of this, while, they get fleeced by ever high tax burden and don't reap any rewards from our current benefit system in any way.
Yes, a decreasing number of hard-working taxpayers.
Right,
so the burden is increasingly falling on those of us who are in some form of work. I mean, there's a lot to pick over there. Let's just talk about blame for a second. I'm in the mood this week to blame someone. who do you point the finger of blame at, Will?
One, I think, regarding the migration stuff, you just have to put it at the feet of Boris Johnson, basically. You have to put it at the feet of him, considering how much he increased migration during his time in office. You also have to blame the DWP, mainly for not reintroducing in-person assessments post-COVID. I think pre-COVID, 80 to 85% of assessments were done in person. Post-COVID, it's around 2 to 4%. Right, so it's welfare by Zoom, basically, a lot of the time. And I think the third position is, I think the sort of system of the DWP is to blame for itself, because there are incentives inside the system just to sort of ding people off and write people off, and that's just creating a greater bill for taxpayers and creating a greater level of welfare dependency. So it's not fun and it's not thrilling to talk about, and it's actually not nice to talk about it at all, because people do get a little bit heads up when you talk about welfare. But I think absolutely everybody, not absolutely everybody, some people absolutely won't, including various Labour backbenchers who voted against modest welfare reforms last week. But people can recognise that this benefits bill is going to become radically unaffordable, and also it's completely unaffordable for British taxpayers to be shelling out for foreign nationals, many of whom shouldn't be here in the first place.
It's one of those issues which has been coming down the tracks for years, right? So this, and I say this with respect, you say that people are going to realise we can't sustain this. They should have realised this years ago. And you're also right to make the point that whenever we talk about benefits in a way that's not seen as positive, we get accused of benefits bashing, right? I wrote a piece for the Daily Express a few weeks ago. It's you don't understand, why are you going after the most vulnerable in society? Well, they're not the most vulnerable in society, are they? I mean, without sounding harsh about it, it's not always the most vulnerable in society. Your thoughts on this, Karl?
Yeah, I'd just like to take up the blame question there to start with. And I think I'm going to spread it around a bit more.
Oh, go on then. We love that.
You have to remember the vast majority of the migrants now claiming universal credit in some form did not arrive under Boris. In fact, almost none of the migrants who arrived under Boris will be claiming universal credit yet, because they won't yet meet conditions to get indefinite leave to remain. There's sort of 211,000, these mostly people who have arrived under the Conservatives before that, including under the new 10-year route they introduced in 2012. So we can point the finger at Boris a lot, but we've not even
it's even
hit
worse.
that. It's even worse.
It's even worse. Okay, sure.
The so-called Boris wave of migration, they'll start to be eligible to get indefinite leave to remain, the right to stay in the country and access these benefits from the start of 2026.
So you're saying it's going to get worse?
It's going to get a lot worse. A lot worse. Right. And we're talking about the working versus non-working breakdown of this amongst the migrant groups. It's only 40% who are working. So it's even more tilted. And we know that kind of benefits claims have been shooting up across the board in recent years. But amongst the sort of UK citizens and people from the common travel area, so Irish people basically, I think since mid-2022, the numbers claiming have gone up by about 43%. But among those on indefinite leave to remain and so on, the numbers gone up by about 73%. So it's increasing more quickly.
Yeah. Do you think there is the political will to actually sort this out?
I mean, one really positive thing I take about from this is the fact they've actually released this data at all. So last year, the Centre for Policy Studies published a paper with Neil O'Brien and Robert Jing, Conservative MPs. And as part of that process, we were doing FOIs and they were doing parliamentary questions, trying to extract this sort of data for the government, the Home Office, the DWP and the Treasury. And it was like trying to get blood from a stone. But, I think we and many others have been hammering away at this and other sort of data things for a long time now. Finally we're starting to see a bit of transparent government on this.
Yeah.
And I think the will to fix it is going to come, if it's not there already, just because the data's out there now and it's going to become increasingly salient. There was latest YouGov poll out today, their trackers of public opinion on things. And now immigration, I think, is, again, the most important issue for voters. And it's at the highest level since June 2016. And we all know what happened in June 2016. So, from politicians a couple of years ago saying, we've solved migration, no one cares anymore. we're back at this point. And, when you look at this data, it kind of confirms, I think, what a lot of people see anecdotally.
But who is the political party that's going to actually grab this by the scruff of the neck and do something about it? Because it's not a vote winner, is it? It takes bravery, I would argue, to actually say, we're going to do this and try and make a difference. And there is a way of getting the message out, because I would look at it and just say this is about actually saving this nation from bankruptcy, because that's where we're heading at the moment, because this is completely unsustainable. But I mean, if you look around, who is the political party, because they're all fully aware of this, who is the political party, Will, do you think will just go, do you know what, let's be brave and let's actually say we have to tackle this for the sake of the nation's finances?
Well, I mean, Kemi and her team have been putting out a decent amount of briefings regarding stripping foreign nationals of welfare, basically. They have committed to that, and that's come straight from the mouth of their shadow DWP Secretary, Helen Whately. Whether reform is going to move into that area as they develop their policy platform, I don't know. It would be a clear thing for reform to do. But when you've got their Kent County Council leader advocating for more, was it social care visas? I'm not entirely sure there's a coherent line within reform regarding it. I mean, I'm sure Nigel and Richard and the rest of them at the top think that, we need to reduce the level of immigration drastically and also make sure that they don't get any welfare. But when, their own council leaders are saying the opposite, it makes you question whether there's any coherency. I mean, what do we think about the Labour Party's immigration policies? I don't know. I don't really know where they stand on immigration. One minute, Keir Starmer is talking about an island of strangers. Next minute, he's begging to the left-wing media, apologising, said, "Oh no, I didn't really mean it. I didn't really read the speech." And then next minute, he's saying, "Oh no, I did mean it, just not in that way."
I never believed. I thought that was the biggest load of old guff I've heard. I've heard lots of guff from Starmer over the last year, but this idea that he didn't read the speech was just,
but he changed that three times.
It's patently a lie. I mean, basically, no, you knew what was in the speech. You read out the language that was used in that speech because you clearly wanted to take some of reform's turf. Then there was the backlash from many of your own MPs who were like, "Oh no, it wasn't anything to do with me, I didn't know about it." So I think that's a complete lie, frankly. But the wider issue of universal credit in terms of people, doesn't matter if their nationality is British or indeed other nationalities, I mean, that is something someone needs to address.
Yeah.
And who's going to do it? Who's going to do it?
Well, if the Conservatives and Reform don't present a coherent welfare plan, then we're sort of screwed in that way, really. I mean, the Lib Dems and Labour are never going to touch it. The Greens probably think it's too low. And then the Scots and Welsh nationalists probably think there's not enough Welsh and Scottish people on universal credit, right? So it's a complete mess. But going after welfare in this country is something that was done during the coalition era to some level of success. So it can be done if there's a political will. I mean, Duncan Smith did a lot of that work, and the universal credit stuff came from the Centre for Social Justice. He did a lot of work in the late Cameron opposition years to put that forward, and they should be credited for that. But we're at a point where we're not able to afford not just our benefits, but we're not able to afford our pensions. We're not able to afford basically our debt interest. No. We're not able to afford basically anything. And the reaction from Labour is basically, well, we just need to squeeze more money out of you lot. That's all we need. And the Tories and Reform have, a few bits of, we'll cut this here and cut this there, but it's not going to cut the mustard. We need drastically reduced spending, and we also need a drastically reduced state. But whether that's going to come from either Kemi or Nigel, considering what their voter base is like, is another thing. Yeah,
I think that's a fair observation. I enjoyed that. That was quite cathartic. Thank you. Let's move it on a little bit to the meat of this week's podcast, looking at the European Convention of Human Rights. Should we leave? Has the time come for us to go? This is not for us anymore. Let's just get some background to the paper that the CPS produced, Karl, put together or authored by the Right Honourable the Lord Lilley. Just some background to that, please, before we start getting into the bones. Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's a very timely paper in a way, because the issue of lawfare, judicial activism, judges overturning decisions of government and parliament, is becoming increasingly prevalent. And I think at the end of the last government, the Tories were very aware of that and very fed up with the situation. And it affected everything from protecting veterans from persecution, obviously returning asylum seekers and stopping at crossings and getting rid of foreign national offenders, but also planning and housing. It's across the board. And I think Labour have now woken up to that problem as well. But because people like Keir Starmer and all term have such a legalistic mindset, they're not prepared to countenance the solutions. And one of the key kind of blocks in the wall of law that's kind of blocking action is the ECHR.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I should have done is given your paper its full title. So is Britain and the ECHR, Past Myths, Present Problems and Future Options. So let's go through some of the past myths.
Yeah.
Go on.
So one of the most common myths you hear is that the ECHR was essentially a Conservative creation, endorsed by Churchill, written by Maxwell Fyfe, who became the Tory Lord Chancellor in due course. And one thing Peter Lilley does in this report is kind of completely demolish that narrative. It helps to understand where that narrative came from. It was pushed in the late 2000s. There was a paper or a book indeed, by Jesse Norman and Peter Oborne, and it was kind of part of the Cameroon modernisation project. We're nice and fluffy, and we believe in international law, and we're not going to turn back the clock and all the things Tony Blair did.
We're the real internationalists.
Yeah, exactly. And that's become established. I think it has been easy for Conservative politicians to try and deflect and say, no, this is betraying our heritage. And of course, in particular, if you're a lawyer, you don't want to see any change to this. That's where the incentives are. But also in the paper, Peter Lilley points out that Labour can't really lay claim to the ECHR either. Like it was the agreement was signed when Clement Attlee was still Prime Minister, but he was against it too. Yeah. You can go back and look in the archives and look at the comments of the cabinet on the drafts being presented by the civil servants. And
he was reluctant, wasn't he? And yet it's been portrayed that he was 100% behind it.
No, and the key thing at the time was, insofar as they did see it as a good thing, it was for continental European countries who've been under fascism or faced the threat of communism to provide them with protections. The strong view in the cabinet was that we didn't need this here because we have 1,000 years of common law tradition. Mm-hmm. We have our rights. We have Parliament. Yeah. It was kind of superfluous, so we kind of sign up to it to show the spirit of the thing, but it wasn't supposed to interact with British law. And the key way in this is originally individuals weren't allowed to petition Strasbourg directly. This subsequently changed under Harold Wilson, and that was all about showing actually Britain was a good international player and was ready to join the EU, even though we should point out that the EU and the ECHR are different institutions. Yeah. It's kind of built up this myth, and I think the whole first chapter of the report is kind of demolishing that apart, and then you can start asking questions for first principles. Has being a member of the convention and subject to court work for Britain? Is it likely to have good or bad consequences in the future? And from there you can work through, do we need to reform or do we need to leave?
I think a narrative has been allowed to develop, and maybe we're all to blame, but certainly I think the media has played a part in it, which is, oh no, we can't leave because without it we would have no human rights as a nation. But that's a fair comment, isn't it?
But that's what people say.
Yeah, that's what they say, and it's been allowed to fester, actually, that view, because it remains pretty much unchallenged. Your thoughts, Will?
Yeah, well, wasn't there that famous advertisement? It might have been during the European Union referendum when it was that who's the guy who plays the bloke? I'm not into sci-fi really. Who's the guy who plays the guy in Star Trek? The bald one, Patrick something or other. I can't remember. Patrick Stewart. Yeah. That's the one. He did he's also a Shakespearean actor, which I probably know more from. But they did this ad about what is the in Monty Python, what have the Romans ever done for us? I think they did what have the European human rights ever done for us? If you remember that? And everyone was like, the right to freedom of speech. It's like, what about the right to fair trial? It's like, yes, because before we joined the ECHR, no one had freedom of speech or a right to fair trial in the United Kingdom at all. It's so interesting because even though in my head I've imbibed the sort of Cameroon Blairite take on the ECHR, because I actually didn't know that before Karl told me that it wasn't like this Churchillian, signing up thing and we're the real internationalists.
Well, that's why this paper is worth reading. Anyone listening to this podcast needs to read it. It's available online because it really does dispel some of the myths.
Totally. I had no idea. But I suppose the question I would ask, Karl, is how is it that even sort of staunchly right-wing people like myself, who have a natural instinct against these kind of international agreements and international laws, how have I still got it imbibed in my head that this is a uniquely conservative project, and how has it been so effective at duping quite a lot of sensible people into thinking that's the case? Was the propaganda just that good, or?
I mean, it's partly, I think it's something that not many people know much about, so you just accept the received wisdom.
Okay.
And I think if you're a conservative, you are default suspicious of a big state and about the state encroaching on the rights of the individual. So if it's something that seems designed to defend against that, protect the individual, without knowing more about it, your instinctive sympathy will be like, oh, this is probably, net a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. No, I like that very much. But I think that in order to basically get to the next bit, which we'll talk about next, I suppose the present problems with the ECHR, is dismantling that past myth is really, really important. So props to the CPS and for you for doing that.
So, I mean, when we talk about the present problems, I think most people listening to our podcast will be fully aware that, essentially I strip it down. I try and strip stuff down in a way that people who aren't necessarily engaged with politics understand. But they'll be fully aware that we have an issue in this country where, quite essentially, if I fillet it's we can't boot people out of this country who shouldn't be here or we don't want to have here because they wish us harm. It gets in the way, doesn't it?
Completely, yeah.
Yeah. So what do we do about it?
The two options are try and reform it.
Yeah.
So you try and carve out some part of it where actually this doesn't apply to foreign nationals who are here or foreign nationals who have committed a crime.
Yeah.
Or you decide we have to resign from it and leave altogether, perhaps with the aim of getting people to agree to reform, or just staying out. And that getting people to agree is the key thing there, because to reform it, every single member of the Council of Europe, which is another one of these international institutions, I think it's 46 members at the moment, has to agree on the reform. And there have been small reforms to the ECHR in the past, all to expand its powers, I should point out, never to bring them back. And each time they've done that, I think it's detailed in the paper, it's taken many, many years of negotiations and work. I just fail to see how that's popular.
I was going to say, I mean, what's your take, realistically, on the chances of it being reformed in such a way that it works for us?
Utterly negligible, in my view.
Yeah.
Utterly negligible.
So we're left with the option of going, we're out, no more.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's important to point out that doing that won't be a silver bullet for some of our problems.
No.
It's because it's necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah.
If you're talking about getting control of the borders again, you also need to look at other international agreements like the Global Refugee Convention from 1951.
Yes.
Absolutely, it's a keystone of what needs to be done.
Let's explore this idea that it's not a silver bullet, because there are some politicians who will have us believe it is a silver bullet. Let's quit the ECHR. That is it. We can control our borders. Immigration, illegal immigration will come down, blah, 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 blah. How do we square that with people? How do we make people understand it's not necessarily the answer? There's other stuff that needs to happen as well.
Yeah. I think we just need to be careful not to overpromise. Part of the problem is that we've now, because of Tony Blair's Human Rights Act in 1998, we've had this interfacing with English common law directly for 2.5 decades. And that is warping not just what's on the statute book, but the whole process of jurisprudence. We've now got a whole generation of lawyers turned judges who are used to doing things in that way. That kind of deductive reasoning from abstract principles, rather than the English tradition of inductive reasoning from the case law precedent that you apply to new problems. And therefore, you might have seen all these stories in the Telegraph about immigration judges in what are called the first-tier tribunals, using now precedent established through reference to the ECHR to stop people being deported because their child won't get the chicken nuggets they like in Albania.
The well-documented story.
Like this. I mean, there's so many utterly mad things. And these are dangerous criminals who can't be removed. And it's not so much the you get with the ECHR, these immigration judges are still going to be saying, well, oh no, we can't do this.
Yes.
So you do have to look at wholesale reform of that tier of the judiciary.
But this coming out of it, getting rid of it, not being part of it, would be a step in the right direction.
Completely. An entirely necessary step. The first step, but not the last step.
Politically, though, who do we think is up for this? I mean, I know old Bobby Jenrick was, I think when he was campaigning to be Conservative leader, he said we should leave. I think I've got that right. Kemi Badenoch, I think, has suggested that looks likely that we should leave. I think I'm not misrepresenting her when I say that.
No, she said she shouldn't look at it.
I'm not entirely sure about reform.
Neither am I. Well, knowing Nigel, he'll probably just say, yeah, why not? But to go back to the point about silver bullet stuff, and I think it's really important to stress that case, because I've fallen into this in the past. I especially fell into this when I got into my first political sort of further when I was about 15, 16 around the European Union, because I thought, well, if we just leave the European Union, then all of Britain's problems will be solved. Yeah. How wrong I was, because turns out Whitehall bureaucrats are just as bad as Brussels bureaucrats, right? And that, democratically elected politicians in the British Parliament are just as bad as those elected to the European Parliament. So I completely agree that it's not a silver bullet, like many other things, such as, for example, we talked about, go back to welfare quickly, to just remove all welfare from foreign migrants is that's not going to plug the £100 billion benefits, disability and health benefits bill by 2029. It's not going to plug it, right? I want it removed, but it's not going to solve the issue. Same with the ECHR. I suppose the question I would pose to Karl is, one argument I've heard against people sort of focusing on the ECHR so much is people saying, well, it's just the new battering ram that the right likes to use. Originally it was the European Union, and then they go for quangos, and then they go for, something else off the civil servants, and then they go for the ECHR, basically. And they use it as an excuse to say, well, I'm not very good at government, but that's not my fault because it's the ECHR's fault, or I can't deport people, not because I don't have the will to do so or the power to do so. It's because, this international agreement won't let me. Is there any truth in that, or are people being really, really cynical, and actually the politicians in charge actually don't have as much power as I don't think they do, and it's actually things like this that do actually get in their way? It's not just about willpower and courage.
I bet if you asked Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's chief advisor, he would agree with this 100%.
Yeah.
Labour, in June 2024, they were thinking, we'll sweep into power and it'll all be great again because we're good moral people and competent, not these evil shambolic Tories. And actually what they've realised since then is governing's really hard. There's structural difficulties. Many of these difficulties are legal ones. This is a real phenomenon that has been identified by people of all political stripes. It's not some mad conspiracy theory.
No, I agree with you. And the interview Harry Cole did with Simon Case just a few weeks ago was really, really revealing, where Simon Case literally admitted that, I was in charge of the blob, even though he hates that term, but then admitted that basically the reason no one can get anything done is actually not due to, a lot of it is due to incompetence, but it's not entirely due to incompetence, but it's because politicians have siphoned away so much power over the last 40 years to organisations you've never heard of, have no idea what they do, and yet you pay for via your taxes. So when politicians get into power, they pull a lever and say, I want to do this, and then nothing happens. and then they think, I don't know what happens here. I need to launch a review, and then the whole shambolic process continues.
So are we concluding that leaving the ECHR is predominantly a good thing? It's a step in the right direction, but it's not the complete answer, because it has to go with wholesale reform of all kinds of other systems that have been in place for far too long that we've tolerated?
Completely. To go back to Will's point about the EU referendum, that was the great missed opportunity to do all the wholesale reform.
Yes.
Again, Brexit was necessary but not sufficient to fix the country. And we just spent 3 years arguing about it rather than doing anything. Perhaps the ECHR, if we can do that along with everything else, will be finally get us moving in the right direction, or turn the ship round, maybe. And before we wrap up this week's episode, I'm just going to lob this at you, because it's something we often hear. We can't leave because of the Good Friday Agreement. That's very common. So I don't have all the technical details at my fingertips, but basically the Good Friday Agreement references the ECHR as applying in Northern Ireland. So the rest of the UK doesn't have to be party to that. And indeed, already there is a constitutional distinction between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland as a result of the Windsor Framework and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, which is actually the other thing that gets thrown at you, like the Good Friday Agreement. Will this rip up the treaties we've got with the EU post-Brexit? And again, there's nothing in those treaties that says you have to be a member of the ECHR for this treaty to work. There are ways that the EU could decide to tear it up, but they don't have to do it.
Will, anything else you'd like to make a point on regarding this?
So I know this is probably going to be a relatively maybe convoluted question, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. You say the ECHR is the first step in the right direction. After that step, what are the next 2 steps that any government should take to properly sort out the borders and also get what we now sort of clarify as activist judges under control, so that we can actually deport people, especially foreign and dangerous criminals?
probably the first step is abolishing the first-tier tribunals and going back to the system we used to have until 80s or 90s, where removing people who were here illegally was essentially an administrative decision. I would say that would be your step one. Secondly, you probably do need a big piece of primary legislation tidying up all the loose ends and very clearly setting out the circumstances in which people will be removed and in which there is an obligation on civil servants and border force and the police to make sure these people are removed.
Will, let's nail it. Is it time to quit the ECHR?
Well, I can't ever disagree with the great Karl Williams. So of course it is. Leave it now. And you know what I'm like? I'm all pro. It feels good, so I'm pro vibe. So I'm pro. I'm pro leaving the ECHR.
And I think the time has come as well. And when I think about it, and I read your paper a couple of weeks ago when it came out, and I also talked to people about this. I point to countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada, who I think I'm right in saying, I'm going to say it's going to sound really embarrassing if I got this wrong, who are not part of this. And yet they're not horrific nations. You know, you're not living your life under any kind of nasty regime. I mean, if you live in Canada, you might have to listen to Mark Carney speak from time to time. That is pretty horrific in itself. But they're not horrific countries, are they? So, and when I say to people, well, you know, these countries, which are civilized countries, decent countries, function perfectly all right, you know, so why can't we? Oh, I never knew that. So that's always my argument, which I think is a pretty solid argument. Yes?
Yes.
No?
Yes, indeed.
Gentlemen, it's been good. Thank you. The document is available on the CPS website, the Centre for Policy Studies. It is called Britain and the ECHR, Past Myths, Present Problems and Future Options. It's by the Right Honourable the Lord Lilley. It's definitely worth a read, so go and have a look at it. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to listen to this podcast. Will, thank you for being on it. Thank you as well, Karl. It's been great. Karl Williams, Research Director for the Centre for Policy Studies. And if you want to listen to previous episodes we do, you can find all of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts and also Spotify and YouTube. It's a nation of taxpayers. That's what you search for. And if you want to send us an email, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.